The California sun, a merciless, blinding orb, beat down on the manicured lawns of the Cypress Landing estates. Every blade of grass was a testament to the iron-fisted rule of the Homeowners Association, HOA, and specifically to the vice president of the board, Ilara Thorne. She didn't just enforce the rules. She was the rules, a sleek, tanned sentinel with the kind of tight-lipped smile that promised bureaucratic retribution. Lydia Vance, a landscape architect in her late 30s with a healthy distrust of conformity, was currently standing in her backyard with a 10-foot weathered wood fence separating her property from the manicured, anonymous expanse of the HOA-owned Greenbelt. The fence was an eyesore, a patchwork of warping, algae-stained pickets that looked like it hadn't seen a proper coat of stain since the Clinton administration. It also, infuriatingly, cut a jagged, diagonal line across the natural flow of her newly designed, drought-tolerant garden, a line she'd always suspected, that had been misplaced 20 years prior. "This is the last piece," Lydia muttered to Miguel, her burly, sweat-drenched foreman who was operating a professional-grade saw. "The whole stretch needs to go. I want the new line set back 3 feet, exactly as the survey marker indicates." Miguel, a veteran of countless HOA skirmishes, wiped his brow with the back of a calloused hand. "You sure about this, Ms. Vance? That old fence has been here since the houses were built. Removing it. It's like kicking a hornet's nest in these places." Lydia pulled the latest certified survey from its plastic tube, a document she'd paid a small fortune for just 2 weeks ago. "I'm not touching HOA property, Miguel. I'm moving my property line back to where it's legally supposed to be. The original builders just slapped this thing up incorrectly. 3 feet of what everyone thinks is Greenbelt is actually my yard. I've got the stamp right here." She tapped the official seal on the map with a determined finger. "Start cutting. I'll take full responsibility." The rhythmic, insistent whine of the industrial saw slicing through the old redwood sounded like a declaration of war in the suburban quiet. Piece by piece, the offending barrier came down, the air filled with the scent of old, damp wood and freshly turned earth. For Lydia, it felt like freedom. The siren call of destruction was answered within 30 minutes. Ilara Thorne appeared like a vengeful spirit, her perfectly tailored white tennis skirt and visor a sharp contrast to the grit and sawdust. She wasn't just walking. She was marching. "What in God's name do you think you're doing, Ms. Vance?" Ilara's voice was a low, dangerous purr that somehow managed to carry over the sound of the equipment. Lydia stepped out from behind a newly cleared patch of overgrown ivy. She was wearing gardening gloves and a confident, though slightly tired, smile. "Good afternoon, Ilara. We're simply moving my back fence line." "Moving it? You've destroyed it!" "That fence is a designated perimeter boundary of the common area, and you failed to submit a formal Architectural Review Committee, ARC, application for its removal and replacement. That is a direct violation of Covenant 4, Section B." Ilara didn't shout. She spoke in a tone of devastating administrative authority, as if reading a death warrant. She was already recording the scene with her phone, her thumb clicking the shutter repeatedly, documenting the carnage. Lydia held up her hands, palms out. "Respectfully, Ilara, that fence isn't part of the common area. It's on my surveyed property line. It always has been. It was just built 3 feet inside my lot." She held out the survey. "See? I paid for a full certified survey. The pins are set. We're simply relocating the new fence to the correct legal boundary. I don't need ARC approval to work on my own land." Ilara didn't even glance at the document. Her eyes, magnified behind expensive sunglasses, were fixed on the pile of broken wood. "I don't care about your survey, Ms. Vance. That fence has stood there for over 20 years. It is an established and accepted boundary. It belongs to the HOA. You are in direct violation. I'm issuing an immediate stop work order. Failure to comply will result in triple the daily fine." She paused, letting the cold calculation sink in. "And effective immediately, you will be assessed a fine for destruction of HOA property." "Wait, Ilara, that's absurd," Lydia pushed back, her voice losing its calm edge. "You can't just claim my property because of a builder's mistake. This is a legal document." She thrust the survey closer, but Ilara took a sharp step back. "I don't need to review your personal paperwork. Alara sniffed, pulling out a laminated card that looked suspiciously official. The covenants state that any established common boundary structure is under the jurisdiction of the HOA. You have defaced, damaged, and destroyed a structure that we, the HOA, are responsible for maintaining. Miguel had stopped the saw. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the distant thwack of tennis balls. The emotional stakes were instantly clear. This wasn't a small disagreement over a flower color. This was a power struggle, and Alara was wielding the HOA's legal budget like a broadsword. Responsible for maintaining? Lydia echoed, her blood starting to boil. You haven't maintained it in a decade. It's practically rotten. And even if it was an established boundary, the legal property line supersedes any HOA rule and the law is on my side. Alara smiled again, but this time it was devoid of humor, a pure expression of professional malice. We'll see about that. The fine will be determined by the board. Expect a certified letter by tomorrow. Consider this your final warning to halt all activity. She turned crisply, her white sneakers crunching on the gravel, and walked away, her phone still documenting the crime scene. Lydia watched her go, a knot of cold fear tightening in her stomach. A fine was expected, but the way Alara had shut down the legal argument, the outright refusal to look at the survey, suggested something far more serious than a slap on the wrist. She looked at Miguel, whose face was a study in grim resignation. "Miguel," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "get the crew off the site, now. Lock up everything." That evening, the certified letter arrived. It wasn't just a fine. It was a devastating penalty, delivered with surgical precision. Lydia tore open the envelope, her hands slick with nervous sweat. The paper inside felt thick, expensive, and terribly final. The heading was stark: Notice of Severe Violation and Intent to Lien. She scanned the text, her breath catching in her throat. The estimated replacement cost of the destroyed fence was itemized at $4,500. The non-compliance fee was assessed at $500 per day, retroactive to the start of the work. But the final, paralyzing line was the kicker: a mandatory punitive fine for the intentional destruction of association property and civil trespassing on common grounds. As determined by the emergency board meeting, $25,000, total assessment, $29,500, due in 15 days. Lydia stumbled back, hitting the kitchen counter. Nearly $30,000. It was an impossible amount, a number clearly designed not to be paid, but to break her. This wasn't a fine. It was an eviction notice masquerading as a penalty. They were using their power to seize her home, all for 3 feet of land she already owned. She slumped onto a stool, staring at the number, the room spinning. She'd been so sure the survey was her shield. The law of the land versus the law of the HOA. She had bet everything on the former, and now she was facing financial ruin. Then, she remembered Alara's complete dismissal of the survey, the almost practiced certainty in her voice. "I don't care about your survey." It was a power play, a simple assertion of dominance. Driven by a desperate impulse, Lydia grabbed her keys and drove to the county records office, a brutalist concrete building that housed the history of every inch of land in the county. The building was usually closed, but she knew the night clerk, an old friend named Gary, from her architecture days. Gary, a weary-looking man with ink-stained fingers, found the original subdivision plat map and deeds for Cypress Landing Estates. Lydia pored over the documents, her eyes darting between the faded lines and the dense legal text. Her own survey was correct. The pin was where it should be. But as she traced the lines of the HOA Greenbelt easement, a different kind of knot formed in her gut. She followed the easement's boundary as it ran parallel to the actual property lines, then looked at the text that defined the common area. She stopped at a small, almost invisible annotation: Fade. The scent of stale coffee and industrial-strength carpet cleaner hung heavy in the air of Lydia Vance's makeshift war room, her home office, now entirely blanketed in official county documents. It was 3 a.m., and the $29,500 penalty notice lay crumpled next to a stack of certified deeds, looking less like a threat and more like a poorly executed bluff. Lydia was on the phone, her voice a low, intense hum, a complete turnaround from the desperation she felt hours earlier. Across the desk, the 5-page Covenant Modification Addendum, 1998, was pinned open, its faded ink highlighting the legal definition of the 3-foot disputed strip, county stormwater runoff buffer, retained in perpetuity by the County of San Vicente, APN 14802-9B. Yes, Gary, I understand the liability waiver. I don't need you to give me legal advice, Lydia said into the phone, her tone sharp but controlled. I just need you to confirm one thing officially on the record. If the Cypress Landing HOA were to attempt to assess a fine for destruction of association property and trespassing on common grounds related to a structure built entirely on a county-retained stormwater buffer, would that fine have legal standing? There was a long pause on the line, punctuated by the static sigh of the county phone system. Gary's voice, weary, cautious. Look, legally, you can't fine someone for damaging property you don't own. The HOA covenants only apply to association common areas. If that old fence was entirely on the county's easement, then the only entity with standing to fine you or demand restitution is the County of San Vicente Public Works Department. He let the statement hang. But they won't. They don't care about a 20-year-old rotten fence on a drainage strip. Exactly, Lydia breathed, a flicker of pure vindication crossing her face. Thank you, Gary. You've been a lifesaver. She hung up and immediately spun her chair to her laptop. This wasn't just about winning. It was about humiliation. Ilara Thorne had used the HOA's power to try and crush her, and Lydia was going to use the truth to dismantle Ilara's authority piece by piece. She started drafting a letter, but not to the HOA board. She knew that would lead to months of internal stonewalling. She needed to bypass their defensive structure entirely. She needed an immediate, public, and undeniable escalation. The following afternoon, Ilara Thorne was midway through a high-intensity Pilates class when her phone buzzed with an urgent text. It was from Richard Sterling, the HOA president, a nervous, middle-aged man who usually delegated all conflict resolution to Ilara. Richard, text, emergency board meeting, 5 p.m., front clubhouse. Now, get here. Ilara felt a prickle of annoyance. The Lydia Vance fine is already settled, she thought. Richard is panicking over a simple property violation. She quickly texted back, "The fine is on its way to collections, Richard." The issue is resolved. Richard's response was immediate and all caps. "No, it's not. Check your email and the county's press release section." Ilara's heart finally skipped a beat. She abruptly walked out of the studio, ignoring the Pilates instructor's bewildered stare. By the time she reached her Lexus, she was pulling up her email. It wasn't just a standard email. It was a formal lawyer-vetted document labeled Official Notice of Intent to File Civil Suit and Complaint of Fraudulent Assessment, sent to every member of the HOA board, their property management company, and crucially, copied to the county supervisor's office and the local news desk. The author? Lydia Vance. Ilara's blood ran cold as she began to read. The letter systematically demolished the HOA's fine. It started with a cold, professional statement. Dear board members, your purported fine of $2,900 for destruction of HOA property is baseless, fraudulent, and constitutes a legally actionable attempt at extortion under the guise of HOA authority. I hereby demand the immediate retraction of the fine and a public apology. Then came the proof. Lydia had attached the certified copies of the 1998 addendum, the plat map, and a sworn affidavit from a former county surveyor confirming the status of the land. The structure I removed was located entirely within the county stormwater runoff buffer. APN 1480209B. This parcel of land is explicitly not an HOA common area. Therefore, the Cypress Landing Homeowners Association possesses zero legal standing, title, or jurisdiction to levy a fine for the damage to said property, nor to assess a trespass fee for entering it. Ilara felt the phone slip in her hand. She hadn't just made a mistake. She had overreached so dramatically that she'd turned a small violation into a massive liability. The entire premise of the $29,500 fine, the cornerstone of her authority, had been built on a foundation of sand. The emergency board meeting was not held in the elegant clubhouse conference room, but in the cramped, windowless storage room they used for sensitive discussions. Richard Sterling was a wreck, pacing like a caged animal. "Ilara, what in the hell is this? The county supervisor just called me. The supervisor, Ilara! They want to know why we're claiming ownership of their utility easement and trying to shake down a homeowner for it." Richard was sweating profusely, his expensive golf shirt sticking to his back. Board member 1, the treasurer, Agnes. "Richard, calm down. Ilara, you said the fine was ironclad. You were so confident. Did you not check the original deeds?" Ilara, who usually commanded the room, stood rigid and pale. "The established boundary was accepted by prescriptive easement. For 20 years, that fence was the de facto line. We maintained it, we painted it. You didn't maintain it." Richard exploded. "That's part of the problem. And prescriptive easement doesn't work on public land, not on a county utility easement." Lydia Vance's letter just laid out the truth. We illegally assessed a fine for damage to property we don't own. The county is talking about reviewing our common area insurance policy. Board member 2, the secretary, Ted. "Richard's right, Ilara. We look like fools. Worse, we look like greedy bullies trying to bankrupt a neighbor." The local news channel, Channel 9, the South County watchdog, just posted a summary of her letter online. "It's a crisis!" Ilara felt a cold, crushing panic. This wasn't a small internal reprimand. This was a public shaming that threatened her position, her reputation, and the entire HOA's solvency if Lydia actually pursued the civil suit. "We retract the fine immediately," Richard declared, running a hand through his hair. "Ted, draft an official retraction and a formal non-committal apology. Agnes, start looking at our legal fund. We need to hire a crisis management firm, not a real estate lawyer." He turned to Ilara, his eyes blazing with furious resentment. "You handled this. You levied the fine. You signed the notice. You have 15 minutes to figure out how to stop Lydia Vance from filing that lawsuit, or you're off the board by morning." Lydia's phone rang. It was an unknown number, but she knew who it was. She answered on the second ring. Lydia. "Hello, Ilara?" Ilara's voice, strained, thin, a far cry from the purring authority. "Ms. Vance, Richard Sterling has asked me to call you." We've reviewed the documentation you sent. There appears to be a significant misunderstanding regarding the boundary lines." Lydia leaned back in her chair, a predatory calm settling over her. "Misunderstanding? Ilara, you refused to look at a certified survey. You accused me of felony destruction, and you attempted to levy a fine that would have financially devastated my family, all for a 3-foot strip of land you knew you didn't own. That's not a misunderstanding. That's fraudulent intent." "That's an extremely aggressive accusation, Ms. Vance," Ilara snapped back, a flicker of her old fire resurfacing. "Is it?" Lydia countered smoothly. "You have less than 12 hours before I formally file suit with the county circuit court. I will be suing for the retraction of the fine, my legal costs, the cost of the original survey, the cost of the certified county documents, and punitive damages for emotional distress and attempted malicious prosecution. I'd guess that total is going to land somewhere north of $100,000. Possibly more, given the public nature of your organization's deceit." Silence on the line. The sound of Ilara's ragged exhale was almost audible. "What do you want, Ms. Vance?" Ilara asked, her voice dropping to a low, defeated whisper. Lydia's smile was cold, sharp, and entirely victorious. She looked at the $29,500 fine, then at the certified county documents that exposed Ilara's lie. The financial fine was a devastating blow, but Ilara's reputation and power were the true targets. "I want 2 things, Ilara," Lydia said, her voice slow and deliberate, savoring every word. "First, I want a signed, certified retraction of the fine, delivered by courier to my house before 8 a.m. tomorrow, with an official board apology stating the HOA overreached its authority regarding a county easement. Second," Lydia paused, letting the silence stretch, tightening the noose. Lydia. "Second, I want you to personally pay for the complete, professional restaining and sealing of the replacement fence I intend to build on my legal property line using the exact specifications I will provide. You can't fine me for destroying the old one, but you will pay for my new one. And I want the receipt of that payment from your personal account delivered with the retraction." Ilara made a small, choked sound on the other end. It was the sound of a powerful woman being stripped of her control. To pay from her own pocket was a public acknowledgement of her personal failure and malice. It was the ultimate humiliating concession, Ilara. "That is blackmail, Lydia." "No, Ella." Part 3. The Board Meeting. The clock in the center of the Cypress Landing clubhouse ticked with agonizing slowness, each second amplifying the tension in the emergency board meeting room. It was 7:55 a.m. The retraction and apology letter, a humiliating piece of parchment demanding a specific concession of error, had been signed and dispatched via courier. The board members, all dressed in varying shades of corporate casual, looked like a jury waiting for a verdict they knew would be guilty. Richard Sterling, the president, his face etched with exhaustion and paranoia, stared at the empty seat at the far end of the table. "Where is she?" he snapped, tapping his pen violently on the polished mahogany. "She was supposed to be here 20 minutes ago. She needs to be the one to deliver the apology to Vance in person. It was her disastrous overreach. Agnes, the treasurer, a meticulous woman who viewed the HOA's budget as her personal savings, checked her watch. She's likely handling the bank transfer, Richard. You know how private Ilara is about her finances. Having to pay Lydia Vance's fence bill from her personal account is absolutely killing her. It's an admission of guilt that goes beyond the official retraction." A low, resonant thud from the doorway announced the arrival of Ilara Thorne. She didn't stride. She glided, wearing a dark, impeccably tailored pantsuit that was an aggressive departure from her usual tennis wear. Her expression was frozen, but her eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were cold, flat, and hard. She placed a thin manila envelope on the table, the payment receipt. "It's done," Ilara announced, her voice a low, precise monotone. The retraction, the apology, and the personal payment for Ms. Vance's fence, staining, and sealing, as requested. The amount was $1,855. She didn't look at anyone, instead focusing on the envelope as if it contained a contagious disease. Richard pushed the manila envelope away. "Good. You understand this is merely a ceasefire, Ilara. We're in damage control. The county supervisor's office is breathing down our necks about the misuse of our authority. And the press is now calling us San Vicentes, most aggressive neighborhood bullies. We need to publicly assure our residents that this was an isolated incident caused by one individual's poor judgment." The implication hung heavy in the air. Richard was signaling that Ilara would be the scapegoat. Ilara slowly raised her eyes and fixed them on Richard. A muscle twitched in her jaw. "If you intend to throw me to the wolves, Richard, you should know that I was merely the executor of the board's collective decision." The motion to assess the punitive fine passed 4-1. Ted, the secretary, stammered, "Wait, Ilara, that's not fair. You framed the fine as necessary to set a precedent. You pushed the legal justification." Ilara leaned forward, her composure cracking just enough to show the terrifying intensity beneath. "And did any of you voters, especially you, Richard, as president, do the due diligence on the property lines that I am now being crucified for failing to do? No. You all rubber-stamped a decision that suited your collective desire to punish a nonconformist. The liability and the blame is collective." The table fell into stunned silence. Ilara had just leveraged the board's shared negligence against them. She wouldn't just resign. She would drag them all down in the subsequent internal investigation and media fallout. Meanwhile, the courier delivered the package to Lydia's house at 7:59 a.m., exactly 1 minute before her deadline. Lydia opened it slowly, sitting at her kitchen table. Inside were 2 documents: the formal retraction, which meticulously detailed the HOA's error in asserting jurisdiction over the county's stormwater buffer, and a bank slip. The bank slip, paid from the personal account of Ilara M. Thorne, was for the exact amount of the fence finishing. It was a total, absolute victory. However, the victory felt cold, incomplete. Lydia had set out to prove a point, to reclaim her land, and she had done both. But the HOA's power structure remained intact, and Ilara, despite the humiliation, was still a key player. The $500 fine was gone, but the source of the problem, the unchecked arrogance of the board, was not. A sudden flash of an idea struck her. She looked at her phone, then at the time. She knew exactly where the board was meeting. This was not the time for lawyer letters and paperwork. It was time for a public confrontation. Lydia quickly changed out of her work clothes into a smart blazer, grabbed the original certified county plat map, and drove the 3 blocks to the clubhouse. Lydia entered the meeting room without knocking. The 4 board members, immersed in their tense, hushed debate, froze. The sudden appearance of their nemesis, holding a large, rolled-up document like a weapon, was a shockwave. Lydia didn't raise her voice. She didn't shout. She simply walked to the center of the room, her gaze sweeping over the guilty faces. "Good morning, gentlemen and Agnes," Lydia said, her voice clear and carrying. "I received your retraction and apology. Thank you for rectifying your egregious error. And thank you, Ilara, for your personal contribution to my new fence. I'm sure it will be a constant reminder of the consequences of your administrative overreach." Ilara's face contorted in a silent snarl, but she said nothing. Richard, recovering slightly, stood up, hands held out in a placating gesture. "Ms. Vance, we sincerely apologize. We have corrected the mistake, and the fine has been fully canceled. We hope we can now move forward constructively as neighbors." "Move forward?" Lydia scoffed. "You attempted to bankrupt me over 3 feet of land you didn't own. You committed actionable fraud against a homeowner. This isn't a simple mistake. It's a systemic problem of unchecked power, and I'm not finished yet." She unrolled the large, heavy plat map on the table with a theatrical snap. The board members flinched. "I only had a certified survey done on my property line," Lydia continued, pointing to her lot, then tracing the boundary into the neighborhood with a confident finger. "But the research into the 1998 covenant modification addendum that exposed your lie required me to review the documents for the entire development. And while I was looking, I noticed something else, something even more catastrophic than the fence." Lydia's voice dropped, tightening the focus on the 4 people in the room. "The addendum you failed to read did more than just clarify the county stormwater buffer. It also included a provision that temporarily transferred the ownership and maintenance responsibility of the Cypress Landing main entrance signage and water feature, the large stone HOA monument, to the developer for a period of 1 year while they completed the final phase of construction." Richard frowned, confused. "Yes, that's standard. They owned it until they deeded the common areas back to the HOA a year later." "Precisely," Lydia said, her eyes gleaming with cold satisfaction. "And as part of that transfer, the developer filed a liability and maintenance rider on all common structures. Now, I'm sure you're all aware of the major earthquake we had here exactly 11 months after that addendum was filed." The board members looked at each other, vague recollection in their eyes. "The earthquake caused minor cosmetic damage throughout the subdivision," Richard recalled. "Nothing major. A few cracked walls, a few loose tiles." Lydia tapped the map. "The main entrance water feature sustained significant internal stress fractures. The main pump housing was cracked, and the whole structure shifted slightly. It needed a full, expensive structural repair. The developer's rider stated that the HOA would take over all responsibility, liability, and maintenance of that structure after the 1-year transfer period expired." Lydia paused for a dramatic, crushing beat. "Richard, look at the date on the original addendum, November 15th, 1998. The earthquake occurred on October 14th, 1999. Richard's face went white. He scrambled for the date. 11 months. When the pump finally failed 6 months later, the HOA paid for the repair. "And we've been maintaining it ever since," Richard stammered, defending the status quo. "Yes, you have," Lydia conceded, her voice chillingly calm. "But when the pump initially broke, when the structural integrity was first compromised by the earthquake, the entrance monument was still legally the developer's responsibility. The repair should have been covered by their liability insurance, which they let lapse right after the one-year period. By paying for that initial structural repair and not suing the developer before the statute of limitations expired, you absorbed the liability for that faulty structure. Lydia's finger stabbed the document one final time. You are all focused on a rotten old fence on a county easement, but the Cypress Landing main entrance monument is built directly over a high-pressure main water line. The structural report I pulled from county records, the report you ignored, states that the entire stone structure is now exhibiting accelerated shifting and potential lateral failure due to the original, unaddressed seismic damage. She looked directly at Ilara, whose face was a mask of utter horror. You tried to ruin me over 3 feet of land. Ilara. But I just found the truth. You, as a board, are collectively sitting on a monument that is not only a major aesthetic issue, but an uninsured, structural time bomb directly over a major utility. If that stone structure shifts and breaks that main line, the subsequent flood and catastrophic damage will make my $2,900 fine look like a parking ticket. Richard Sterling collapsed into his chair, breathing raggedly. The fight over the fence was personal. The liability for the entrance monument was existential. The game. The low, metallic groan that shuddered through the clubhouse was sharp enough to silence the desperate breaths of the board members. It was not the distinct, rolling sound of an earthquake, but something closer to a massive, loaded machine settling under strain. It was the sound of Lydia Vance's warning becoming a terrifying reality. Richard Sterling was the first to move, scrambling to the window that overlooked the main street. What was that? What is happening? He demanded, his voice high-pitched and frayed. Lydia Vance stood perfectly still, her expression a mix of professional concern and cold satisfaction. That, she stated calmly, pointing to her unrolled plat map, is likely the sound of the foundation for your uninsured. Unstable stone monument finally shifting under its own tremendous, ill-supported weight. It's what happens when you ignore seismic stress fractures for 25 years. Ilara Thorne, her composure utterly shattered, sprang from her seat. You planned this. You're manipulating us. How could you possibly know the structure was failing today? I didn't plan the failure, Ilara. I simply researched the history of your incompetence. Lydia shot back, her voice gaining a hard edge. I knew you'd find a way to deflect blame, so I went to the County Public Works office and filed a formal structural integrity and high-pressure waterline threat report yesterday. That report triggered a mandatory, immediate inspection by the county engineer. Lydia pulled a final piece of paper from her envelope, a brightly colored official form. This is the temporary notice. The county engineer is likely out there right now, performing a survey to mark the instability zone. The whole entryway has probably been cordoned off. Richard, ignoring the documents, dashed out of the room. The remaining board members, Agnes, Ted, and Ilara, huddled together, the shock paralyzing their ability to speak. In less than a minute, Richard returned, his face a sickly gray. He held up his phone, showing a photo of the grand stone entrance. A bright orange official do not enter tape was strung across the entire entryway. A surveyor's tripod was set up, and a large black crack, newly exposed by the ground's subtle shift, snaked visibly through the monument's base. It's true, Richard whispered, his voice hollow. The county is here. They've shut down the main entrance. Agnes, the treasurer, grabbed Richard's arm. The liability, Richard, the cost! If that structure comes down and breaks the main line, the insurance won't cover us. Our policy excludes damage caused by pre-existing, unaddressed structural defects. This entire HOA could be facing a multi-million-dollar assessment that will bankrupt every single homeowner in Cypress Landing. Lydia watched the panic spread like a virus. They had tried to destroy her financially for $2,900. Now their own recklessness threatened the financial ruin of the entire community they were supposed to protect. You have a choice, Lydia said, stepping forward into the chaos. She was no longer just a homeowner fighting a fine. She was a crisis consultant holding the key to their survival. You can spend the next 6 months arguing amongst yourselves, hiring expensive lawyers to deflect the liability, and letting the problem worsen until the county demolishes the structure and bills the HOA 10 times the cost. Or you can hire a structural engineer to perform an emergency stabilization and work with the county today. Ilara, recovering slightly, saw an angle. And you, Ms. Vance, conveniently have the name of an engineer who can do that, I suppose? Lydia smiled, but it was a calculating, professional look. I'm a landscape architect, Ilara. I work with structural engineers all the time. But I'm not providing a name for free. This is now my price for saving your board and potentially the HOA from complete collapse. Richard looked at the shattered monuments of his authority, the $2,500 retraction, the personal fence payment from Ilara, and the county shutdown notice. Name your price, Ms. Vance, immediately. Lydia slowly unrolled the map once more, pointing not at the monument, but at the entire length of the common area bordering the back of the homes. The problem isn't just the main entrance. The problem is the unaccountable power you wield, Lydia stated. I want immediate signed concessions that will ensure this never happens again. I want 3 things, she held up one finger. 1, I want a complete public exoneration delivered at the next General Assembly meeting, explicitly detailing the HOA's failure in the boundary dispute and the subsequent structural failure of the monument due to unaddressed liability. This includes a full public resignation of any board member who votes against this measure. She held up 2 fingers. 2, I want the HOA to formally hire me as an independent consultant to conduct a comprehensive 6-month review of all common area boundary lines and maintenance records, specifically addressing any other unaddressed liability risks related to the 1998 addendum. This position will include a substantial salary and the right to present my findings directly to the membership. Ilara's eyes were wild. You want to pay yourself to investigate us? That's an egregious conflict of interest. Lydia's voice was ice. It is guaranteed access to prevent you from burying another truth. And if you refuse, the lawsuit for the $100,000 in punitive damages will be filed this afternoon, along with a full disclosure to the local press detailing the monument's liability time bomb. She held up the final 3rd finger. 3, I want immediate, unappealable ARC approval to install my new fence along the true surveyed property line, 3 feet back from the county easement. Furthermore, I want a permanent written amendment to the community covenants, drafted and voted on by this board, that removes the power of the vice president to unilaterally issue punitive fines exceeding $1,000 without a full board vote and mandatory legal review. Lydia looked straight at Ilara, whose face was a mask of cold fury. This last point was the knife twist. It gutted Ilara's executive power and relegated her to an irrelevant figurehead role. Agree to all 3, and I give you the name of the structural engineer, the details of the initial structural fault, and a plan to mitigate the county's immediate action, Lydia finished. Refuse, and you face the consequences of both the structural collapse and the lawsuit, which I assure you will be far more costly. The room was silent. Richard looked at Agnes, who gave a quick, desperate nod. Ted looked at Ilara, who was radiating poisonous resentment. We accept the terms, Richard finally said, his voice flat with defeat. Draft the contract, Ms. Vance, and give us the engineer's name. Now. Lydia smiled, a triumphant and deeply unsettling expression. She wrote the name and number of her engineer on a sticky note and pushed it across the table. Congratulations, Richard, Lydia said. You just learned the difference between rule of law and abuse of authority. The fence is built, and the power structure is broken. Later that afternoon, a news crew from Channel 9, the South County watchdog, was broadcasting live from the main entrance of Cypress Landing Estates. The camera zoomed in on the bright orange warning tape and the long, fresh crack running through the base of the massive stone sign. The reporter held a microphone to the face of a grim, nervous Richard Sterling. Mr. Sterling, you are here confirming that the popular Cypress Landing sign has been deemed structurally unsound by the county due to an unaddressed structural defect, correct? Richard cleared his throat, reading from a statement Lydia had insisted he use. That is correct. This unfortunate situation, along with a recent boundary dispute, has illuminated systemic failures in the HOA's governance and record-keeping. The reporter turned toward the camera. The source of this discovery, we understand, is local homeowner and independent consultant Lydia Vance, who exposed the HOA's liability after they illegally fined her nearly $30,000 for removing an old fence. The camera suddenly cut to a new shot. Lydia Vance, standing tall and professional on her property line, next to Miguel and his crew who were happily cementing in the post for her brand new, beautiful cedar fence. Lydia Vance, interview, calm and direct. The HOA attempted to exert authority over property that wasn't theirs. In doing so, they revealed their own catastrophic negligence regarding the county's liability records and the safety of the entire community. I'm simply making sure that from now on, the residents' interests, not the board's ego, come first. The scene cut back to Richard, who, desperate to regain a fraction of credibility, committed to the final humiliating act, and, on behalf of the entire board, Richard finished, looking directly into the camera, I would like to offer a full public apology to Ms. Vance for the baseless fine and the resulting distress. We are committed to working with her to fully reform our governance and ensure the safety of our common areas. As the reporter wrapped up the segment, Ilara Thorne, watching the broadcast from her car parked down the street, slammed her fist into the steering wheel. Her public humiliation was complete, her executive power neutered, and her nemesis was now the highest-paid consultant on the payroll. She hadn't just lost the fight. She had paid for her opponent's victory. Final beat. The camera pans across the neighborhood. The HOA entrance is blocked off and cracked, a symbol of their broken authority. In the background, the sun catches the freshly stained, beautiful cedar of Lydia's new fence, perfectly straight and precisely on the true property line. The neighborhood is physically and politically divided by the truth. The air in the Cypress Landing clubhouse was thick with a toxic mix of panic and resentment. It was the night of the Emergency General Assembly, a meeting that should have been a formality but had become a reckoning. The failure of the entrance monument, now wrapped in yellow construction tape and resembling a derelict tomb, dominated the atmosphere. Lydia Vance stood at the front of the room, not on the stage with the board, but a few feet below it, an independent force. She was flanked by her newly hired and HOA-paid team, Ben Carter, a sharp, no-nonsense structural engineer, and Sarah Lynn, a meticulous corporate governance lawyer. Richard Sterling, the HOA president, stood before a microphone, looking like a man forced to read his own eulogy. He had to deliver two things: the promised public exoneration of Lydia and the resignation ultimatum for board members who couldn't accept the new reality. Neighbors, Richard began, his voice shaky. We are here tonight to address two critical matters: the immediate liability risk posed by the main entrance structure and fundamental flaws in our governance, brought to light by Ms. Lydia Vance. He paused, swallowing hard. The board accepts full responsibility for the gross error in assessing the fine against Ms. Vance. The fence she removed was and remains on a county stormwater buffer and was never the property of the HOA. Ms. Vance acted within her rights, and the fine was a colossal failure of due diligence and an unacceptable overreach of authority. He looked toward Ilara Thorne, who was seated at the end of the board table, her face a mask of furious, concentrated loathing. Furthermore, Richard continued, adjusting his tie, Ms. Vance's persistent inquiry led to the discovery of a critical structural defect in the main entrance monument, stemming from an unaddressed seismic event 2 decades ago. Had this liability been allowed to fester, the entire association could have faced financial catastrophe. We thank Ms. Vance for exposing this danger. The room buzzed with shocked whispers. Homeowners who had grumbled about Lydia's fence now looked at her with grudging respect. As per our agreement with Ms. Vance, Richard announced, his eyes darting to the floor, we are now voting on her proposed governance reforms. This includes hiring her as a 6-month consultant and, crucially, amending the covenants to require full board approval and mandatory legal review for any punitive fine over $1,000. He read the next statement with agonizing slowness. Any board member who votes against these essential, immediate reforms, or who refuses to accept the full, public record of the board's failures, is required to submit their immediate resignation. The vote was taken by a show of hands. Agnes and Ted, relieved to be throwing the responsibility onto someone else, quickly voted aye. Richard, desperate to save his own skin, voted aye. The camera, set up by a local news crew invited by Lydia, zoomed in on Elara Thorne. She was the last holdout. Elara slowly raised her hand, but instead of voting, she pointed a trembling finger at Lydia. "This is a hostile takeover." Elara's voice was venomous, cutting through the tense quiet. "This woman broke the rules, destroyed property, and now she is profiting from extorting the board. She used a technicality to blackmail her way onto our payroll and seize executive control." Lydia stepped forward, her voice cutting and professional. "The only thing I profited from, Elara, was your negligence. I fought for 3 feet of land and ended up saving this community from millions in uninsured liability. And since you seem incapable of accepting the truth or adhering to the will of the board, I have one last piece of research for you," Lydia signaled to her lawyer, Sarah Lynn. Sarah stood up, holding a thin folder. "Mrs. Thorne, while Ms. Vance was researching the 1998 addendum that exposed the county easement and the structural defect, she uncovered a second, separate liability that falls solely on you." Elara froze. Her eyes, filled with rage moments ago, now contained pure, cold fear. "In 2012, Sarah continued, her voice clinical, the HOA filed a major insurance claim for hail damage to the clubhouse roof. As vice president, you signed off on the claim payout and authorized the contractor. The contractor, Thorne Construction Group, was a company owned and operated by your husband, Mr. Marcus Thorne." A collective gasp swept the room. "The total claim was for $85,000, Sarah stated, her eyes fixed on Elara. "However, our review of the HOA bylaws and the state of California's nonprofit corporation code shows that a board member, or their immediate family, is prohibited from contracting with the association above a de minimis amount without a unanimous vote of the entire board and a detailed public conflict of interest disclosure. Neither of those conditions was met in 2012. You signed the check and your husband cashed it. This wasn't just a political battle. This was an allegation of felony self-dealing and embezzlement. The board minutes from that year show the repair was discussed, but not the contractor and certainly not the familial connection," Richard whispered. Looking utterly betrayed, Elara shot to her feet, her chair scraping violently across the floor. "That was a decade ago. We used my husband's company because he was the best price. This is a smear campaign. The best price or an illegal transfer of HOA funds?" Lydia challenged, looking directly at the news camera. "The statute of limitations on civil recovery is still open. Elara, not only have you lost your authority, but the HOA, under my new consultancy, will be legally compelled to recover that $85,000 in fraudulently obtained funds from you and your husband. You will be required to vote on the motion to initiate the lawsuit." Elara Thorne was cornered. Her power was gone. Her reputation was destroyed, and now she faced a massive civil lawsuit that would expose her to the district attorney. The $29,500 fine she tried to levy against Lydia was now dwarfed by the $85,000 she would have to pay back, plus Lydia's consulting fees and legal costs. Elara slowly sat back down, her entire body shaking. She couldn't vote nay and cling to her political position because the next vote would be about suing her. She couldn't vote aye because that would confirm her total loss of power and seal her fate. Elara fixed her gaze on the empty space ahead, her face a picture of absolute, terrifying defeat. She didn't vote. She didn't say another word. She simply picked up her purse, stood up, and walked out of the meeting, leaving her hand silently lowered, signifying her refusal to participate or agree, and thus triggering her required, immediate resignation. Richard Sterling watched her go, then faced the room, a man who had narrowly escaped the blast radius. "Well," he croaked, picking up the gavel. "The motion passes 4-0. Ms. Vance, you are now our consultant, and the reforms are in effect." Lydia Vance watched Elara's retreating back, a profound, chilling sense of finality settling over her. She hadn't just won the fight, she had restructured the system. She looked at her beautiful new cedar fence from her back window the next morning. It stood perfectly straight, exactly on the true property line, already sealed and stained, courtesy of Alara Thorne's personal bank account. She no longer felt the paranoia or resentment. She felt the quiet confidence of knowing the truth. The HOA would never try to tell her what to do again. Final beat. A delivery truck pulls up to Lydia's house. It's not the courier. A man steps out carrying a massive, official-looking plaque. He walks to her newly installed fence, right on the boundary line, and affixes a small bronze plate to the new cedar post. Lydia walks out to see it. Engraved on the plaque in elegant script are the words, "The Vance Line, a permanent marker of legal truth. A quiet, powerful, and total victory."